Good morning, everyone. We would like to welcome you all to the second talk of the Global Dialogue on Dalit Studies in South Asia. This dialogue is an initiation of the Journal of Dalit Studies, which is the publication of the Dignity Initiative Nepal in collaboration with the academics and scholars from across the globe. Dignity Initiative is a Kathmandu-based research institution working exclusively on the field of knowledge production, academic activism, and policy interventions on the issues of Dalit. The primary purpose of this dialogue is to create a rigorous discourse on Dalit issues by inviting prominent scholars and para-academics from across the South Asia and beyond. This dialogue intends to facilitate rigorous debate on dominant narratives on caste and inequality and offer an alternative discourse on Dalits' emancipation and empowerment. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to request Professor Prashant Negi, the editor of the Journal of Dalit Studies, for his opening remarks, as well as the introduction of today's speaker. Professor Negi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roopji. On behalf of the Journal of Dalit Studies, I welcome Professor Varghese to today's dialogue. Let me, for the benefit of all the participants, introduce Professor Varghese. He is currently the Vice Chancellor of National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration, an apex body of the Government of India, located at New Delhi. Prior to that, he was at NIPA, he founded the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education, of which he was the director from 2013 to 2019. He was also with UNESCO Paris from 2006 to 2013 as the head of governance and management at the International Institute of Educational Planning. Professor Varghese has managed the Asian Regional Network for Training in Educational Planning and is responsible for planning for decentralization in education in India. Editor at the Journal of Educational Planning and Administration, he is also on the editorial board of several journals. An internationally acclaimed educationist, he has published over 30 books, 200 plus research papers, and carried out research projects in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the CIS region. Professor Varghese is almost on every committee on education in India. I just don't know how you do it, sir. So we are delighted to have you here today and are eagerly awaiting to listen to your views on equity in higher education. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Varghese.
Thank you very much to Dr. Roop Sunar and Dr. Negi. I am extremely grateful to the Vice Chancellor of Jamia Millia and Dr. Prashant Negi of the K.R. Narayanan Center for Dalit Studies, Minority Studies, Jamia Millia, for inviting me to deliver the prestigious Global Dialogue series. Friends, first let me say that I'm not expert on Dalit studies per se. I've done little bit of work in the area of equity, higher education, progress in higher education, etc. So I'll be talking more in terms of equity and how it is affecting the disadvantaged groups in general. That will be the general tenor of my presentation. My main argument will be that the world is growing, but it is growing unequal. Educational inequalities have more enduring impact than economic inequalities. Constraining of educational opportunities lead to low intergenerational mobility, cumulative marginalization, and durable inequalities. I'll repeat what I'm trying to say. Intergenerational mobility, reduced intergenerational mobility, cumulative marginalization, and durable inequalities. I'll be touching upon this in my presentation. When public policies have contributed to this situation, the level of higher educational development has reached a stage where we need to explore the scope of institutional level interventions to address student diversity. I feel that a major share of the students, even from the disadvantaged groups, are already in the educational institutions. So our focus need not have to be confined to increasing or improving access conditions alone. Our work in that area needs to be continued. At the same time, there is a need to shift our emphasis little more closely, examining little more closely what is happening to the students who are enrolled in the higher education institutions, especially from those from the disadvantaged groups. The institutional strategies on equity and inclusion, focusing on the disadvantaged groups, will maximize the total benefit from education and its sharing among all segments of student community. I think we are reaching a stage where we feel that we should argue special actions or measures that we take are benefiting only the disadvantaged group. No, that is not true. This is contributing to the total benefit from education, and everybody benefits from that. That should be a general feeling and a way in which we should look at educational subsidies or special privileges or special concessions that are given to the students from the disadvantaged groups. Because it is not a concession that is given, it is their right, and therefore there is a need to see it from a much broader perspective than from the perspective of only of the marginalized groups and the benefits going to the marginalized groups. What I'll try to do is that I will try to discuss a little bit about the economic inequalities, then equity policies and inclusion, and the marginalization process that is taking place, partly from a little global perspective. Then I'll come to India and focus on the inequalities that are generated and that are perpetuated in India, especially in the field of higher education. Increasing income inequality has become a global phenomenon in the recent decade. When I say recent decade, it implies that from 1970s or 1980s onwards, we find that inequalities are increasing. This is also a stage or a phase. We find that market was playing an important dimension. Globalization was playing an important dimension. State was in a stage of retreat. And you find that the socialist countries in general were in a state of retreat. And you find that there is an advancement or progressive advancement of the market. And there is a retrieval or retreat, not retrieval, retreat of the state. And what we find is that this is also a period coinciding with the increasing inequalities. A second trend that we find is that in the 1990s, we see the largest number of countries coming to the framework of democratic countries. And especially after the disappearance of the Soviet Union, you find that elections have become very common in many countries, what we call as the CIS countries. A large number of countries came to the fold of democracies in the 1990s. Unfortunately, this also coincided with a situation of increasing inequalities, although democratic societies are the least tolerating societies when it comes to inequalities. So you find that the trend that we find is that we are growing, but we are growing unequal. This is the case in India too. So what you find is that income inequality widens when the rate of returns to investment is higher than the rate of growth of the economy. And that is what we find even during the COVID period. You find that a massive accumulation process that is taking place in the corporate sector, especially in the context of some of the corporate sectors. This is what is happening. The widening inequalities is the result of varying rates of progress. And when the growth in income is disproportionately higher for the upper income groups, the result is increasing inequalities. And economic inequality is also a sign of unequal sharing of resources in the present and the prospects of continuing inequalities in the future. So disadvantage is often based on social identity that all of you know, since you are from the group studying, researching on issues related to Dalit concerns. So all of you know that. So what it means is that the level of inequality and the prospects for intergenerational mobility are negatively correlated. In other words, what you find is that in societies where you find higher levels of inequality, we find the intergenerational mobility is very low. And as a result of that, the inequalities are reproduced. Social and economic inequalities are reproduced as a result of the framework of development that is used. It implies that unequal societies, one's birth decides one's future economic prospects. So inequalities can stifle upward social mobility, make it harder for the talented and hardworking people to get the rewards that they deserve. And it is very important to see that how public policies can change, because you find that there are experiences in different parts of the world and in different countries where you find that the progressive state action and policies have reduced inequalities. So for example, when we look into the SDG objectives and goals, especially goal number 10, it very clearly states that the commitment is to leave no one behind. That's a very good commitment, a good slogan, if implemented properly, to mitigate inequalities. However, since you are from the research institutions, it is also important to note that inequalities is a major concern in social sciences, but mostly this is done by economists, and based on economic inequalities have got a primary focus. I am happy that in the recent past, social inequalities are also becoming an important part of the discussions and discourses. It is found that UNESCO report on social science research, the latest report 2016-17, shows that 80% of the studies on inequalities are carried out in the developed countries. The framework used is very different from the framework that we may like to use, especially in India, because the race is considered to be one of the major concerns, and most of the inequality dimensions that one is talking about in the research, in social sciences, in the Western world centers around race issues, whereas this is not the main issue for countries like India, perhaps in the South Asian countries. It is very important to note that. So what I feel is that it is important to see that how the issues related to equity and inclusion are an integral part of the marginalization process that takes place in society. So if you find that democratic regimes in general, as I mentioned earlier, are less tolerant to inequalities, are more looking more towards egalitarian concerns and egalitarian framework for development. And that you find that this is not a trend that you find immediately. If you look into a little bit of history, one find that one of the major publications in the 1970s was Growth with a Redistribution became a global phenomenon, and it became a major concern, even from the World Bank point of view. Ever since you find that in the 1970s, Chenery and others brought about the book Redistribution with Growth, that changed the attitude towards growth. And if you look at the experience of the East Asian countries, and what is sometimes referred to as the East Asian miracle by the World Bank publications, so that high growth rate, high income growth can be sustained with lower levels of inequality or higher levels of equity. This is something that the East Asian economic miracle has shown to us for sustained growth with sustained equality levels for more than 30 to 35 years. And if you look at in India, sometimes it is referred to as, if you look at the EPW articles, Kerala model of development, which very clearly showed that even at lower levels of economic development and growth, you can have higher order social development. This is something that is shown. And if you take the case of Sri Lanka, again, we find that lower levels of economic growth, but higher order equity and social development that is taken place. These are examples where we find that the growth and equity and the higher growth and higher equity are not in terms of creating a conflicting situation. There can be a harmonious situation that can be created. If you look a little bit into the theoretical backdrop, and if you take three authors, John Rawls, A.K. Sen, and Charles Tilly, you find that there are a lot of discussions and the debates that are taken place, because John Rawls underlined the principle of justice as fairness, focusing on societal level concerns than individual level concerns. His equal liberty principle and the difference principle highlighted different aspects of inequality existing in societies, and the equal liberty principle stipulated that individuals are entitled to a maximum amount of liberties to the extent that it is good for the society as a whole, and that it can be applied to all. I underline the word can be applied to all. The difference principle holds that inequalities are accessible or acceptable only if they are addressed to the greatest benefit of the most disadvantaged. Both this talks about the need for interventions and equity interventions in favor of the disadvantaged. Professor Sen, in his idea of justice and through his capability approach, one is the 1980s, the other one is in this century itself, maintains that each individual is born with unique capabilities and is also faced with multifaceted barriers while they are entering into the social realm and also the educational field. Therefore, services needs to be prioritized in the most effective way to the most disadvantaged groups. Charles Tilly, in this century, especially in the first decade of this century, discusses the idea of durable inequalities, implying the transmission of poverty and inequality through generations. The concept of durable inequalities maintains that inequalities exist through asymmetrical relations between groups and keep them disadvantaged to one tract, keep the disadvantaged to one tract and the privileged to another tract when it comes to the question of distribution or sharing of the benefits of the social resources. It's very important to see that he sees this in as two tracts, and these two tracts remain almost unchanged. A lot is talked about the human rights approach. Then the human rights approach takes a multidimensional view of focusing more on the horizontal inequalities, that means group inequalities that lead to exclusion of certain groups in all societies. This is something that you find. I'll come to this point at a later stage. We find that certain groups are excluded. The exclusionary behavior is very dominant and prominent in many societies. In some societies, it is more, but in democratic societies, which are strong, not only in terms of elections, but also in terms of providing a framework for development, we find that this is very different. The inclusion may be, inclusion is an important dimension of equity, and equity is achieved when inclusion is guaranteed. That is something that is ensured. So this need not have to be treated as two separate identities. They are very closely linked. Inclusion implies valuing the diversity and that we recognize in respect of everyone's unique qualities and attitudes and attributes. Inclusion is the action of being included in a group or within the structure. It involves authentic and empowered participation and a true sense of belonging. So it can be in different ways this can be done. And when you're talking about educational institutions, we talk only about admissions, but also there is a process of academic inclusion in the classrooms and social inclusion in the campuses. It is very important to distinguish these factors. Some of our studies in CPRG try to elaborate this distinction, make these distinctions, elaborate these changes, So that is very important to notice that these are, it is not only at the entry point, ports of entry and points of entry, but also at later stages while continuing the educational processes, these inequalities are generated, So social exclusion is one of the ways in which you find that inequalities are perpetuated, marginalization process is perpetuated over a period of time. And you will find that this exclusion is a process of denial of opportunities, leading to reproduction of poverty and inequalities across generations. So exclusion implies unequal access to resources, unequal participation, and denial of opportunities. This is something that we find. And also this happens because of the marginalization process that takes place. And marginalization can be spatial, or marginalization can be social, or both. And in many cases, you find that there is an intersectionality between different dimensions of disadvantages. It's easy to see that if you consider the case of a tribal woman or tribal women in the remote rural areas, you find that they face spatial marginalization, social marginalization, and marginalization in terms of economic status, and also marginalization in terms of gender. So you find multiple levels of marginalization, that is, or social exclusionary behavior that you find in such cases. In the urban areas, you find that, unlike in the rural areas, you find that in the urban areas, the facilities are better, amenities are better, and you find that some forms of inequalities are less pronounced in the urban areas when compared with the rural areas. Education has emerged as a factor contributing to economic growth and also the distribution of income. If educational facilities or opportunities are not equally distributed, then there is a possibility that it can become a source of intergenerational inequality. Let me repeat this point. Education can be one of the instruments for equalizing opportunities and equalizing progress by all groups, if the facilities to pursue education are distributed more equally. In the absence of that, it contributes to accentuation of or culmination of intergenerational inequalities with more force and strength. And this is one of the important points that was recognized by what is called as the Learning Generation Report. They also focused on what they call as the progressive universalism. Progressive universalism, which means that if you want to progress, if you want to provide education, you start with the least progressed groups in the world and prioritize it. Reprioritize the investments, reprioritize the budgetary allocation, reprioritize the social actions, and reprioritize the state progressive actions in favor of those who are the least developed. That is what is meant by progressive universalism, that is enunciated by the Learning Generation Report in 2017. Gordon Brown was the author of this report at that point of time. So public spending is a substitute for parental inputs in low-income groups. So when you talk about education and its development and in the disadvantaged groups, one has to see that there is a direct conflict between the educational objectives and the survival objectives of the disadvantaged. Because the human capital theory, which postulates that education is an investment, it gives more returns. The neoclassical tradition or otherwise is perhaps not an apt theory to attract people to the fold of education, especially the poor and the disadvantaged, because investment is not their priority concern for the most of the poor people, and especially those who belong to disadvantaged groups, which includes the economically disadvantaged groups. What one finds is that they are not their fight is for survival. In the context of those who are coming in conflict with the immediate and the future, this always choose what is immediate, and in the process, education does not get a priority in their portfolio of investment or in their portfolio of activities that they like to call. And this has a lot of implications for progress of education. It is in this context that the move towards Right to Education Act, etc., of 2009 in India becomes very important to see that these actions are these activities directed towards prioritizing the disadvantaged are finally given a clear-cut dimension, given a clear-cut policy framework, and also at times it is not supported with the budgetary requirements or the financial allocations which are required. Under such circumstances, this also becomes a political rhetoric, rather than, or a policy rhetoric, rather than a realized reality translated in concrete terms into operational practices. In India, what we find is that the economic inequalities has widened over a period of time. And if you say that, what you find is that if you take the last 60 years, from 1960 onwards, and the last 60 years, what one finds is that the share of the wealth among the top 1% of the population has increased from 11.9% to more than 42%. Today, roughly more than 2/3 of the income is within the hands of 10% of the top population, top income groups, and the remaining is shared. Less than 10% is shared by 50% of the population in India, which means that not only that the income levels have declined, or the variations or disparities in distribution of income has widened very, very sharply. So what also one finds is that these are very important dimensions of change that we find. But if I take you to the educational field, what one finds is that these changes in economic development need not be directly felt in the education field. One trend that we find in education, which is not common in economic sector, is that educational inequalities in India, measured in terms of Gini or Gini index, what one finds is a change. That is, the poorer developed states or less developed states have higher inequalities than the more developed states. What you find is that in many instances, there is variations in the rate of growth and development, and as a result of that, the growth brings or growth leads to more inequalities. But that is not the case that we find. If you say, for example, if you take a state like Rajasthan, or a state like Uttar Pradesh, or a state like Bihar, etc., you find that the Gini index is very high in 49 and 48. But when you come to places like Kerala or Nagaland or Mizoram or Manipur, etc., you find that the Gini index is 0.25. This comes closer to what we find as the global equity in the indices. If you go to any of the Nordic countries, especially Denmark, it is the Gini index is only 0.25. And if you go to Norway, it is 0.26. These are the most equal societies in the world. In India too, if you go to the states which I mentioned, you find that inequalities are very less. And what is also equally important is that in some of the states, it is not only the overall inequalities, but also inequalities between rural and urban areas. Also, you find it to be substantially reduced for a period of time as a result of the growth. Or in other words, let me repeat the initial hypothesis that I put forward. The initial hypothesis is that the educationally less developed states, you find lower levels of educational development and higher inequalities. Whereas in educationally more developed states, advanced states, we find that inequalities are also less when compared with the educationally backward states. Basically, when countries are poor, what we find is that perhaps inequalities can be less, but that is not the case that we find in the context of education. Now, if you look at what are the strategies that were adopted in India to ensure that inequalities are mitigated. I like to see that one of the important contributions is the constitutional guarantee of identification of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes as the least developed groups in India, which needs prioritized intervention. In 1987, we will find that in addition to that, SC, STs, you will find that you also added OBCs categories into this list. That means these are the, when you're talking about the quota system, this is very important. And more recently, that is in 2019, the constitutional amendment tried to incorporate what we find as the 10% reservation for economically disadvantaged groups. Or in other words, these four: scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, OBCs, and the economically backward groups. These four groups together forms the disadvantaged groups in general in India. Although the major concern is between scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, followed by other backward classes. That is the way that intervention strategies have been designed. But when we try to talk about intervention strategies, one finds it very difficult to implement certain type of things. Some are spatially recognized. Say, for example, the tribal development programs in India in the 1960s were targeted to the tribal development groups because they could be spatially, it is possible to target them spatially. Whereas it is not possible to spatially target either OBCs or of scheduled caste categories, you know. So therefore, that were more based on individuals and institutions or household based, whereas the other strategies were also targeted to the regional development processes or regional prioritization process. This is very important to understand these changes. It is very important to understand these changes in terms of the intervention. We have succeeded in introducing the quota system. Now at least 49.5% of the enrollment in higher education institutions are expected to be from the disadvantaged groups and 10% from the economically disadvantaged groups, you know. So that is the way we see the changes that are taking place. And basically, these have succeeded in bringing many children, many students to the colleges and the universities. We also find that more than bringing them to the colleges and the universities, there are also given facilities for hostel facilities or financial incentives, etc., to keep them ready or keep them sustainable in the context of educational discourses and educational process that are taking place in the campuses. However, it is not very clear how the expansion of higher education has benefited different groups. Say, for example, when the system was very tiny sector, higher education was a tiny sector, when gross enrollment ratios were less than 10% in the system, the distribution of the enrollments was more in favor of the privileged sections. Today, we are talking about a massified system of higher education. The enrollment ratios are more than 26 to 27%. And the total enrollment is more than 37 million students. Therefore, there are a lot of changes that are taking place. The student composition has changed over a period of time. And you find that there is a substantial difference that has taken place in terms of change in the orientations. The question is that, yes, massification has taken place. Did massification help the higher education? Did massification benefit the disadvantaged groups in India? Is some of the important dimensions, is some of the important questions that are to be asked very clearly and very specifically. The empirical evidence indicate that in India represents a situation of faster growth of enrollment of the disadvantaged, but continuing inequalities. So in other words, in the midst of inequalities, the progress is taking place. All groups benefited. All the four groups that I identified benefited from the the expansion of higher education and the massification of higher education. There is no doubt about it. But the rate at which they benefited is very different. But I like to argue that there is a catch-up. There is a process of catch-up that is taking place, which is a very positive dimension. For example, if you consider the past decade between 2011 and 2019, the percentage improvement in enrollment of the general group categories of students was only 6%, whereas you find that in case of SC, scheduled caste, it was 8 percentage points. And also you find that in case of the scheduled tribes, it was 6.2 percentage points. In other words, what I am trying to say is that the increase in the enrollment among the disadvantaged groups is faster than the increase in enrollment in net addition to enrollment by this group. I am not talking in terms of the numbers, I am talking in terms of the percentages. So there is an improvement that you find. So this I like to call as the catch-up process that is taking place, which shows signs of improvement over a period of time or the decade, you know. So this can be seen for all categories, and perhaps the OBC category has increased, or their share has been increasing at a faster rate. In fact, the competition today, if I can put it like this, is between the share of students coming from the OBC category to higher education and the share of students coming from the general category. And what you find is that perhaps in the last decade, the OBC category has overtaken the general category. For example, between 2011 and 2018-19, what one finds is that the share of student enrollment decreased in case of general categories from 48.8% to 43%, while that of the OBC category increased substantially from 32% to 36%. So what you find is that the competition, what I am trying to say is that among the disadvantaged groups, certain groups are progressed faster, and those groups are in competition with positively in competition with the students from the general categories. You know, that is a change that you find in the recent past. So I feel that the 1987 policy of including including the OBC's categories in the reservation and quota system has made a substantial change to this. Now, there are the forms of change or forms of inequalities, if you are discussing about it. What one finds is that gender inequalities have declined. And this is true in case of the disadvantaged groups. And if you compare the disadvantaged groups with the general category, again, you find that gender parity index, or the share of females enrolled to the male students per 100 male students, you find that there is substantial improvement. And in many cases, what you find is that female enrollment surpasses in some of the states where the GER is more than 30 or 35%. The GER exceeds the ER of, or the gross enrollment ratios of women or girls exceed that of men. You know, this is something that is you find. It's not only in India. This is a global phenomenon which I have highlighted in some of my writings, where we find that globally in the school education, even when the enrollment ratios are 80% or 85%, you find that gender parity index is less than 1. Whereas in higher education, we find that when you have a when you have an enrollment ratio of around 30 to 35%, we achieve gender parity index. Or in other words, gender parity index is reached at a much lower levels of GER in higher education when compared with the school education. This is true in India too. Even though our enrollment ratios are only 27%, we have almost reached gender parity index equivalent to 1. And in some of the states like Tamil Nadu or Kerala, where GR is quite advanced, you find, or higher, we find that gender parity index is much beyond 1, you know, which means that there are more girls or more women in the colleges and in the universities than men. This is a very positive sign. So there is a narrowing down of inequalities in the gender inequalities, but this is not getting reflected in terms of two other forms of inequalities. If you come back to the disadvantaged groups, as I mentioned, within the disadvantaged groups, there is a change that is taking place. There is a progression that is taking place. The catch-up process is better, but at the same time, the differences between the OBC categories and SC/ST categories is widening rather than narrowing down over a period of time. There are two other forms of inequalities, which is also directly related to these dimensions, which is increasing. I think that is one of the regional dimension. Regional inequalities in education development is increasing. And you find that the states which are remaining economically backward also remain educationally backward. And also this has a lot of implications for that. I think this is also an area that we had to take into account in terms of the market processes and private higher education. What we find is that there is an intersectionality that is developing, or there is a correlation that is developing between enrollment patterns or concentration of educational institutions and the market processes or the private higher education institutions. States like Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Puducherry, Tamil Nadu, or Kerala, where you find that the private higher education institutions are established at a very, very fast rate. You find higher concentration of higher education institutions. And as a result of that, what one is finding is that there is something that is called as urban bias in development. The urban bias in higher education development is increasing, or because there is a discount that we can talk in terms of the distance discount, sometimes referred to in educational development, which means that if you are closer to the urban areas, your cost of higher education is much lower than those people who are living in faraway places. Because if you are from a rural area and if you want to study in an urban area, it is not only the fees which may be low, or maybe you are given full concession, but also your stay cost is much more important, or more expensive item. And as a result of that, education becomes more unaffordable to the people from the rural areas, etc. This will have a lot of implications when we are talking about mergers of universities or institutional consolidation to make the higher education institution should have at least 3,000 students per institution, should have 3,000 students, which is initiated or which is recommended in the policy, new education policy of India. This will have a lot of implications. Or in other words, what I am trying to say is that there is a process, a market processes closely associated with the regional dimensions, which widens or which increases regional inequalities in higher education in India. And I should say that the distant discount is highly pocketed by or highly realized by two groups of people: higher income groups from the general category and also higher income groups mostly from the OBC category. So these two categories are the beneficiaries of the market process-led or market-mediated process of higher education development. The urban concentration that is taking place in higher education is also benefiting these two groups more than other deprived and disadvantaged groups in India. So I think it is very important to see that how the different groups are benefited from higher education and admissions, that needs to be taken into account. So market orientation in higher education has also influenced the ways in which we talk about equity and inclusion, the ways in which we talk about the disadvantaged groups. I think two trajectories are developing, evolving in India. One, if you belong to the disadvantaged groups, either socially or economically or otherwise, your sheltered place or the place where you try to seek admission is the government schools or government colleges. And if you are in the other categories of higher incomes, you find that the place where you seek admission is private institutions. So let me repeat this point because it is very important. What I am trying to say is that the biggest or the widest increase or the largest increase in inequalities in enrollment in higher education is between the economic categories. There may be a coincidence or there may be an intersectionality between the social and educational changes that we are talking about. So you find that there is a change that is taking place in terms of the way in which who is benefiting from that. The largest, the widest inequalities exist between the economic groups. For example, if you take the share of students enrolled or share of students who are enrolled from the lowest quintile group, that means lowest 20% in 2007-8, and if you consider the same group in the year 2014-15, there is a marginal increase. But the distance between the share of students enrolled in higher education, the lowest quintile group and the highest quintile group has widened over a period of time. So that is what I say, that regional inequalities, like regional inequalities, inequalities in terms of economic groups also have widened. So this increase in inequality is a major concern for us, because how do we compensate these groups in the higher education institutions to promote more equitable process, and that is the place where we find that the markets play an important role. Today, 78% of the institutions and more than 66% of the students are studying in the private institutions. So when we talk about public policies and social policies to mitigate inequalities, we have to think in terms of the role that can be played by the state, the role that can be played by the public policy, because most of a major share of education is in the private sector. So this arrangement is very different from the arrangement that existed in the 1960s and 70s, when public sector was the dominant force and dominant party in terms of providing education, where the government policy, government support in financial terms, and the government management played a very important role. But today, the situation is very different. So the question that can be posed, the question that should be posed is that to what extent the state intervention will be helpful, to what extent the state intervention will be helpful to change the direction of change or the direction of progress that is being made in the higher education sector. It is important because the cumulative effect of marginalization of the disadvantaged are reflected through not only through the entry level, but also through the performance while they are in the institutions. These changes include, interestingly, what one finds is that in many a time, what we find is that even when we try to establish more equality at the ports of entry, at the entry level, these equalities are not maintained while they are completing their studies and in terms of their learning outcomes, So therefore, it is very important to see that the intervention policies, that is why I was talking about the institutional strategies to mitigate the problems of the disadvantaged or the challenges faced by the disadvantaged, assumes a more important position today on the agenda than what it used to be 20 years or 25 years. So let me articulate this. Basically, some groups in the disadvantaged groups have progressed faster. They have crossed the threshold in terms of their economic advantages. And as a result of that, they had taken into account the economic advantage and also the advantage or the concessions given by the system for those people who are from the disadvantaged groups, those concessions. These two together, economic advantages on the one hand and the concessions that they received on the other hand, have made them progress faster. And therefore, there is a need to look into the policy dimensions, even a disaggregated analysis of the groups who are benefited more than the other groups, rather than treating them as one homogeneous category and extending them the support as the uniform support to all the categories. There is scope for that. That needs research. I think institutions like Jamia Millia and many other institutions where the equity studies are given more focus will be in a position to come out with more analysis of the data, and one will be in a position to provide a better understanding of this. Let me take up one more issue in terms of the factors that are influencing these inequalities, because I have 5-6 minutes more. Inequalities, that is, those inequalities are related to the language of instruction. I know that it's a very sensitive issue, but let me make this point clear. I am not talking about changing the media of instruction, but I am saying that there is two pathways that are growing. The pathways that are growing are, you go to, if you are from a poor, economically poor or socially deprived group, you go to mostly to government schools, and the government schools provide instructions in regional languages. And when you come to the higher education, the transition to higher education becomes difficult. Even if you get admission to the institution, the catch-up, the phrase is catch-up. The catch-up becomes, catch-up may become easy, but how do you integrate with in the academic sphere in terms of the studies becomes more difficult. And that is one pathway for progress that you find. If you are socially disadvantaged, the chances are that you will be following regional languages, you will be studying government schools, and you will be ending up in institutions, and you find it very difficult to follow the studies. That is because the media of instruction may be changing. Another related dimension is that if you look at the choice of subject areas, a larger share of the deprived groups or disadvantaged groups try to go to classes, go to subject areas which are more arts-based, humanities-based. And you find that in terms of the unemployment rate, these are the people who are more unemployed. So you find a difference not only at the entry level, even if equality is attained at the entry level, we are not in a position to maintain that semblance of inequalities at the later level. You find substantial difference between the general category students and the disadvantaged groups in terms of learning outcomes. This is true of education at the school level, and this is true of education at the higher education level in both cases. So there is a learning outcome. So there is a cumulative learning deficit that is developing more among the disadvantaged groups, So, and this cumulative learning deficit is one of the major concerns today, which leads to cumulative marginalization of people from the deprived groups and the disadvantaged groups, because they lose in their competition for jobs, the employment market. And if you look at the unemployment rate or the employment rate is very much in favor of the general category. Say, for example, if you consider people with undergraduate degrees, scheduled tribes, the unemployment rate is 8.9 or 9%. In SC categories, it is 10%. In OBC categories, it's only 8%. And in others category, it is only 6.4%. You find that as you move from disadvantaged groups to the general category, the rate of unemployment is declining, This you find both at the secondary school level, higher secondary school education level, and also at the undergraduate and postgraduate level, which means that the educational process that you are talking about, we need to focus on how do we change the processes to make it more progressive and in favor of the students coming from the disadvantaged groups. And that is the way that we can improve the learning outcomes and also the employment outcomes of the educational processes that we are talking about. So there's substantial difference. Coming back to the point that I started with, what one finds is that the income can be redistributed more easily, whereas educational attainments cannot be redistributed so easily. And as a result of that, those who are educated and those who are not educated is one category. But the distances and differences that are developing today are more in terms of those who are better educated and well educated from good institutions, and those who are poorly educated. They are educated, not educated and non-educated. They are educated, but poorly educated from poorly run, poorly managed institutions, and with a language advantage for some of the people, the situation becomes more complex, complicated, and therefore the issues of what I like to call as the cumulative marginalization process or exclusion from not only education but also employment on the basis of the learning outcomes, you find that that is the place where we need to invest. That is the place where we have to intervene actively, both in terms of public policy. I will say that there is immense scope for improving things at the institutional level. I am saying this, many people, this argument, I want to touch upon this argument. Some people argue that if larger share of disadvantaged groups of students are admitted to the institutions, perhaps the overall quality may decline. It's not my argument. This is one argument that is put forward many a time. But what one finds is that some of the institutions, I take the example of, say, for example, Yadavpur University or Jawaharlal Nehru University or Hyderabad University, where you find that the share of disadvantaged students is much higher than what is actually mandated. They are also top ranking institutions. If you take the Navodaya Vidyalaya scheme in India, you find that a good fair share of students from rural areas, especially rural areas, and poor households are also participating in that. And if you see their performance while in the schools or in the colleges or in the institutions of higher education, or when they are outside in terms of the labor market, what one finds is that there is a substantial change that we can expect, and there is more equity-oriented policies and equity-oriented interventions have definitely improved their capabilities, their capacities, and improved their well-being in terms of jobs, better jobs, and higher income and salaries, So there is a lot of change that one can see that, So therefore, what one try to argue, what I would like to argue is that, firstly, when we have the educational facilities distributed, not in terms of equality, when there are unequal distribution of educational facilities, you will find that this will be reproduced in terms of inequalities in the next generations. That is what I like to call as durable inequalities and the role of education in creating or mitigating durable inequalities. The second dimension that I would like to highlight, or I highlighted, is that the process of cumulative marginalization process or cumulative exclusion from the mainstream and the main activities, economic activities and social activities is another one. The cumulative marginalization that is taking place among the disadvantaged groups. I will say that one of the factors that leads to this is the cumulative learning deficit. If you look into the performance of many of the students belonging to the disadvantaged groups, even when they got admissions in good institutions, they are not very encouraging. So you find that there is a cumulative learning deficit that is developing. So these three factors, durable inequalities, cumulative marginalization process that is taking place, and cumulative learning deficit that is accruing to the disadvantaged groups are three issues which makes the situation of the disadvantaged groups in a very, very pretty bad situation. And my hope and my feeling is that while public policies and public funding are necessary, I feel that at the public funding level, as I mentioned, since market is playing the major role and share in terms of enrolling students and teaching students in the colleges and the universities, making the system affordable means it is the public institutions. But at the same time, there is scope for targeting the public investment, even when it is less in terms of the amount, there is a need for targeting to avoid perverse effects of public subsidization process, whereby the subsidies are pocketed by the better off sections in society. So one point in the policy intervention at the national level, at the macro level, will be in terms of how do we target the limited public resources in favor of the disadvantages. The second and more important policy is that how do we try to ensure that equal opportunities are created not only to enter the institutions, but also perform well in the colleges and in the universities. That is the place where the academic, the distances in academic distances can be reduced. And when you find that feel that you are included in the processes, those are the areas where intervention is needed. I have seen in some of the universities, I do not want to name many of them, they have tried to see that the compensatory classes are given. UGC has introduced compensatory arrangements or compensatory classes, and also different support mechanisms for the deprived students. But even without any of the central schemes and state schemes, publicly funded schemes, every institution, if they have a proper plan and a strategy to address the issues of diversity, that will be a better way of rewarding the students from the disadvantaged groups. So friends, let me end by saying that the issues of durable inequality are to be addressed rather than inequalities that are faced in the present one. Although inequalities faced in the present juncture will be contributing towards that. Our goal should be to mitigate inequalities in the future and try to see that the disadvantaged group as a group improves and all the groups are getting benefit out of that. That is a context in which we should put an end to what I call as the cumulative marginalization process that is taking place as a result of the policies and also the practices followed at the institutional level, and the cumulative learning deficit that is developing among general category students, and especially among the students who are from the disadvantaged groups and who are not doing academically well. Unless we address these issues and also look into the public policy from the point of view of targeting of the public resources, limited public resources in favor of the disadvantaged groups, so that we are in a position to facilitate a level playing ground. And more importantly, without the public, without any of these aspects that you are discussing, especially the public policy dimensions and the public funding, I feel that there is immense scope for us to intervene at the institutional level to develop strategies to see that the equity policies are included in the academic dimensions, the teaching learning processes, and an inclusive policy is followed in the teaching learning processes and in the campus life. This does not require any additional budgetary allocations, or this does not require any of the regulatory arrangements from the UGC or from the central government or from the state governments. That is an area I feel that there is scope for all of us as researchers, as teachers, and as students to intervene and fight for it and get some of the things, So the intervention in the process factors becomes very important. That becomes a more equity-oriented policy towards changing the direction of or changing the status of the disadvantaged groups in the future, and that will help in building towards more equitous society, a democratic society where partaking in all spheres, economic, political, and social spheres becomes a goal, a target to be achieved by all of us. That should be the way in which we may look at equity policies and how to mitigate or how to improve the overall situation in the country, especially of all groups of people belonging to the disadvantaged groups and also the others. So we try to see a policy whereby catch-up can be faster and integration can be better and learning outcomes outcomes can be improved, which will benefit everybody. That is the way, that is the need of the hour that needs to envisage policies at the institutional level and at the national level. Even when the national level or state level policies are not forthcoming or budgetary allocations are not forthcoming, we still have scope to intervene at the institutional level. And that is the place where we should focus our attention to mitigate or to improve the overall situation in the country. Thank you very much for a patient listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Varghese, for your very interesting and insightful talk. I'm glad that Professor Varghese has agreed to take some questions from the floor, and therefore you can please write your question for him in the chat box, or you can also take floor to ask your question. My only request is please try to make your question short and precise. Prasanji, yeah, please, you may ask question.
Thank you, sir, for your rather insightful talk. While it is very clear that, intersocial group disparities in higher education are increasing, and on the other hand, we also see that there are aspects of durable inequalities related to intersocial group, learning disabilities in learning outcomes, or in terms of their regional aspects or their class aspects. And in the case of, say, South Asia, we also have aspects of ascribed identities affecting learning outcomes. So while we see public policies that are targeted, and at the same time they are group specific, and we continue to see that implementation of such policies are actually not addressing equalities of the kind that they were intended to address. So do you think that there should be a shift now from interventions in terms of social policies, from targeted or group specific or affirmative action, to something which is more inclusive in terms of looking at, say, diversity?
No, I think, look, I don't want to have a misunderstanding that I am not talking about intervention strategies based on the economics, paradigm, move away from the caste-based quota systems, etc. I am not saying that. But what I mean to say is that there is something that is happening which we are not actually taking into account. When I try to see that the change that we find in terms of other backward classes and others, following a blind approach of reservations or quota systems, it is time to think in terms of these changes. Because if you look into the private universities enrollment in India, you find that large number of students, well-to-do students from the OBC categories, are increasingly getting admission. You will also find the capitation fee colleges, they are also getting benefited. So there are a group of people who cannot be really categorized as disadvantaged, although when we go by caste, they are disadvantaged categories. So it is time to see that how do we better target. That's why I use the word targeting. Better targeting the limited public resources and through policies whereby we will be in a position to try to see that it should not be going negatively, adversely to any group. That's why I said that, centers like yours will be in a position to do a detailed, disaggregated analysis of the progress that are made, and that should be the basis for policy decision. So I'm not a person who is arguing for we should put an end to the caste-based quota systems or any of the concessions that are given. But I will say that certain groups are doing better, because the competition today is trying to see that many of the groups want to be inside. I don't want to name any of the groups because it is not fair on my side, but you've seen that some of the groups which need to be included in the category of OBCs are also the groups which are the very dominant. So these dominant groups, if they come to in the category that they take these concessions of 5% in the educational scores or the marks that are secured in the admissions and in the employment, etc., that is at the cost of the others. Say, for example, how do you try to see the policies of the disadvantaged? Now, there is an argument that, yes, if somebody from a disadvantaged group is going to, say, for example, in IIT, and somebody from a general category is going to IIT, what you invariably you find that even after 5 years or 6 years of studies, when you go to the employment market, the student from the disadvantaged group may be getting a lower salary than the better lower level job and lower salary than a person from this. Then the question that is posed is that, in fact, the disadvantaged group, in a sense, try to block the total benefits that would have been accrued at a higher salary that would have been accrued. The person has taken a seat, and as a result of that, the returns to education, investment in education has come down. This is an argument that is put. But how do you justify that? We say that this is not justified on the basis of the rate of returns analysis or hardcore economics analysis. It is to be justified in terms of the social justice argument. It is to be based on, that is why I introduced a Rawls argument or that was Fekeson's argument and Tilley's argument, etc., related to the approach to equity and how do we look at equity. So there is a need to see that, rather than from the hardcore economic analysis, you have to come out. Although I am myself is a quantitative and economist, I feel that we should come out of that and have a disaggregated analysis so that the decisions that are taken are not moved through the emotional identity issues, but more on the basis of the detailed empirical analysis that can be done. That's what I want to say. Is it okay, Dr. Negi?
Fine. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
System has systematically reinforcing or reproducing or sustaining discrimination. Is that true? If not, why numbers of educated persons have increased, but discrimination is still continued against Dalit, women, and other marginalized groups? Why it is happening? Do you think we need education restructuring?
It is not only a question of education being restructured. What I feel is that when I talked about the institutional interventions, what you find today is that the students are highly diversified. It's a diversity of students in the classroom, in the schools, in the campuses. But the teaching community is not that much diversified. We have to wait for a day when the teaching community is also as diversified, or diversity that we experience in the student community is also experienced in the teacher community. That has not happened because there is a generational benefit for those who are coming as teachers in the universities and colleges. And there is a generational gap for the students who are coming. The students who are coming to the colleges and the universities from the disadvantaged groups are maybe first generation learners, etc. But that is not the case with the teachers. So there is a gap. I call it as a silent revolution that is taking place in the universities. I am not talking about the demonstrations that are taking place in the universities, but there is a tension that is taking place in terms of the academic achievement and the academic processes and academic progress that you make, So therefore, there is a problem. But if you look at the changes that you are talking about, see, expansion legitimizes using educational qualification as a basis for job selection. Therefore, educational expansion is very necessary to justify what we find as the benefits of education to certain groups. In India, what is happening is that if you take most of the prestigious jobs, there is not much change that has taken place in terms of the intake. You may find one person from a disadvantaged group may be getting selected into a good job, etc. But majority of the selection that is taking place is still a reproduction, or a social reproduction and economic reproduction is by generation of the same group of people, So education is used as a, if I can use a term called screening device. And when we use education as a screening device, there is a high level of correlation between the social origins and educational qualifications, and especially the education qualification from the prestigious institutions. So education functions more as a screening device, whereby the elite selection process becomes more sophisticated. Because previously the elite selection process was from a small group of people. But today, if you have to select somebody, it is from 37 million. So what will you do? If you get a degree from IIT or IIM or Jawaharlal Nehru University or Jadavpur University or Hyderabad University or Banaras University, you are a different category altogether. That's why I said that the distances between the students studying in higher education has increased as a result of the process of education process, as a result of the education process that is unraveling. Therefore, I feel that to a large extent, there is a reproduction of the same inequalities. But at the same time, what you find, a positive change that you find is that influence of parental education on the children to go for higher education or otherwise has declined. Say, for example, how do you do that? If you make an analysis of data of Sweden or Norway or Finland and also Denmark, these 4 countries, if you make an analysis, what you find is that the intergenerational mobility in education, I'm not talking about the intergenerational mobility in general, intergenerational mobility in education is very high. But if you find the same thing, it is very low in many of the developing countries, which means that there is a social reproduction that is taking place through the educational processes, and education becomes yet another instrument as a screening device to see that this process can be legitimized. Because now you cannot say that you are selected because you are from a rich family, or your father is influential or parents are influential. You say that, no, you have a degree from IIT. And IIT degree is better than that. Or you went abroad and you had a degree from Harvard University, so that is better. Or you had a degree from Oxford University. So the basis on which the comparisons are made are changed. So expansion becomes a legitimizing process for continuing with the social reproduction of inequalities, unless equity policies are deliberately introduced by the public system.
Thank you. So we have one more friend there, Ishwar Adhikariji. Can you please ask a question?
Sir, I just want to ask a question, highlighting means in the case of Nepal, that in Nepal, sometime back we had a, I think, court order that one person should not be given a quota system twice in his life, or mostly, or if the parents are from, let's say, from MPs, then their children should not be given quota system to their children. Okay, so my question is, if the quota systems and all these things are mostly to represent the people from the lower strata of the society, then should not there be always a, I mean, is there any problem that if a person gets twice or thrice quota system in his life? I want to see know your views. And regarding education, we see high drops out in lower school level from this lower strata of the population, especially so-called Dalits and these Madhesi people. We see dropping out, high dropping out, and actually the institution that I have gone through, I see very less representation of them in higher education systems. So should not we, how can we make sure that they do not drop out in the early stage of their education? Maybe that, yeah, I think that is my two questions.
Okay, thank you. You are raised to two issues. Let me see that. The first one, whether the reservation can be given twice or the advantage can be given twice or thrice, this is a political question. So, for example, in India, when reservation policy was implemented for promotions, it created a lot of commotion. Why? Because till yesterday, somebody was your junior, and he or she belonged to the disadvantaged group. Because of the reservation policy, suppose you become senior to me tomorrow, I'm not ready to take orders from you. So that created, in the real situation, that created some problems. So that is one set of issues. But I don't think that till we find that, what we need is not stars. What we need is generally a large number, a share of people in the system who belong to the disadvantaged groups, at least proportional to their proportion in the population. Till that time, I feel that we should continue. But these are all political decisions based on certain dimensions which are very important, certainly important. How do you redistribute even the reservation for the benefit of larger number of people? And you know that, in most of the cases, in all democracies, when you have to face elections, what you find is that these popular slogans take precedence over real slogans. And therefore, many a time you find that many of these decisions are taken as a result of the popular pressure of the peripheral politics exerts its influence to take these type of decisions, So that is the way that one tries to see that. Whereas the other question, sorry, what was it on? The other question was on what?
Drops out in early
Dropout.
stage of schooling.
That is a serious issue. So, for example, South Africa is one of the best examples to cite that, when they moved to, when apartheid was abolished in 94, 95, they tried to change the admission policies in higher education institutions. And they found that a large number of Black students were enrolled. And many of them could not continue studies because they did not have the basic, they were not supported with the basic academic achievement. So, for example, the Stanford study in India showed that many students, they had not given the caste-wise breakup, but it is said that many of them belong to the disadvantaged groups. Many students in the engineering schools and colleges, they were very poor, their scores were very poor in physics and mathematics. And as a result of that, the belief is that a good number of students who are dropping out from the disadvantaged groups are also dropping out because they are not in a position to integrate with the study programs or compete with the students from the other backgrounds when it comes to the academic competition, So therefore, that's why I said that, there are a lot to do for institutional arrangements or the strategies. There are many institutions, say for example, if you go to JNU, you will find a lot of language support courses are given to the students. And those who are following, as I mentioned, coming from the government schools and coming from the colleges, which are regional colleges, where the language of instruction was the regional language, when they come to higher education, they find it very difficult to cope with the situation. So therefore, there is a process by which some support is provided, to them, how to learn English, how to read English. In India, the difficulty is that the language policy is very sensitive. We do not make a distinction between medium of instruction and proficiency in language. I don't think that even when you have the medium of instruction as a regional language, we can have proficiency in language in another language. But what we do is that because of the political compulsions, we talk only about the medium of instruction and we do not discuss even the issue of proficiency in the other language, whether we like it or not. English as a language of academics, of business, is very important because most of the publications that are coming out, the well-renowned publications and the theories that we study even in the regional languages that are initially done by people who are using English language. And if you want to read the originals and improve our standards, then there is a necessity for these type of languages also to be picked up by the students. So dropout is also a misfit. Sometimes there is a misfit argument that is done when we introduce 25% reservation in the private schools, for the students belonging to the deprived groups or the economically poor groups. So there is a change that we need to make at the institutional level, rather than enrolling them and say that now we have enrolled, our job is finished. We should try to protect them, mentor them, and try to extend support, academic support, so that they are in a better position to compete with the students coming from other backgrounds, social backgrounds.
Thank you, Professor Varghese. We have got two more questions in the chat box, and then we'll conclude today's program. The first question is from Achal Rawat. The question is, sir, I wanted to know that the NAP is talking about promotion of regional languages at the same time. The same languages is creating problems in the universities. The books are mostly in English and the other languages are neglected in the universities. So isn't such policies are widening the gap which is already there?
So that is what I partially answered that. My question is that the question is not to change the media of instruction. The solution is to see that you make students proficient in languages other than the mother tongue. Don't compromise on the media of instruction. Don't compromise on the media of instruction. You don't compromise on the media of instruction. Try to do that. But at the same time, nobody stops you from doing, say, for example, in many students in the abroad, when they study, they also study also the languages, Spanish language, French language, German language. If you are in an Anglophone country, or if you are in a French country, they also learn English language and they go to English universities or the vice versa. So one has to make a distinction between medium of instruction and proficiency in languages. I don't think that the students have any problems in studying two languages, not at the higher education level. They should start at the school level. You cannot start all these things at the higher education level, because in the higher education, you are a student only for 3 years. But whereas in the school system, you are a student for 12 years or 14 years. That is the time that we should try to see that the student should be introduced to an international language, so that the students will be able to read the books in that, and they feel more competent when they come out and compete in the job market, So my answer is that one has to make a distinction between medium of instruction and proficiency in languages. While medium of instruction can be a political decision that is led by what is considered to be most desirable, nobody stops any student from acquiring another language as proficiency in language.
So the final question is from Dr. Aita Vishwakarma. He says, equality in education is accountable only in the quality of education. Quality depends on the investment. Privatization has played a critical role in making the quality in education. But access to private education in higher levels is beyond the reach of marginalized people. How can we minimize such gap of quality, empowering marginalized community in higher education in private sector? Is there any way forward?
See, the traditional pattern in Indian education is that you send your child to the private English medium schools when the child is 3 years old. And the child will be in a better position to compete for an IIT examination, IIM examination, or an examination competitive test that is held for NEET, JEE, or JNU test, or any other institution, where selection is based on test, in a position to do that. So that is a change. In other words, what I am trying to say is that it is not correct to say that, the private institutions' quality is very high in higher education. And if you look at public institutions, quality is much higher in higher education. And getting into such quality private institution, public institution is more difficult. Public means government institution. Becomes very, very, very difficult. So therefore, that question itself is not true. The other dimension of the question is about the affordability. You cannot have a system of affordability of even public institutions. You look at the fee rates, fee levels in the top ranking public institutions in the country. It has gone up like anything, whether you take it IIT or IIM. What is the fee rate? It has gone up. So therefore, even then, the private institutions are charging more fees. So the question for government of India, or for the public policy for that matter, is that should we constrain the possibilities of satisfying social demand for higher education by saying that the government does not have money, so we will not expand the system? Or should we expand the system with the possibility of giving, not budgetary allocations are made, the private sector will be coming, and what are its implications? Certainly, those students who can afford, if they move from the public institutions to private institutions, it is also indirectly, if you have policies, if you are indirectly trying to create a situation whereby more places and spaces are created for the student from the lower socioeconomic background. But at the same time, there is a need for excessive commercialization and making excessive profit by the private institutions. There are a lot of discussions that used to take place and court cases in the 1990s, Unnikrishnan versus the other one, and many other cases were there when it was a question of capitation fee colleges, So there is a need for regulation. But I will not say that in the present circumstances, the public sector will be able to fund and finance institutions to meet the social demand in general, because the public institutions account only for 22% of the enrollment. When 78% is in the private sector, we cannot expect this to happen. You asked about the NEP. Even in the NEP, if you find that we all expected a quantum jump in terms of budgetary allocations when our Honorable Finance Minister made the budget presentation in February this year. But in fact, the allocations to education declined. It did not go up. So all the policy statements regarding the ambitious plans, etc., that you're talking about is very good. And taking India to a stage of universalization of higher education is certainly laudable. But this should be supported with more public funding. But what we found in this budget is that a decline. I hope that maybe in the subsequent budgets presentations, there'll be an increase in the budgetary allocations to education and especially for higher education.
Thank you. With this, we have come to the conclusion of today's program. Thank you so much, Professor Varghese, once again for your insightful talk and equally engaging question and answer session. I would also like to thank all the participants for your patience and engagement. We'll be back with another talk next month. So with this, I would like to declare the end of today's program. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosana. Thank you very much to everybody.